Hi, in this episode, we're going to talk about AI and machine learning and why the colorist is not dead yet. Stay tuned.
This episode is sponsored by our friends Flanders Scientific, who are leaders in color-accurate display solutions for professional video. Whether you're a colorist, editor, DIT, or broadcast engineer, Flanders Scientific has professional display solutions to meet your needs. Learn more at flandersscientific.com.
Hi, I'm Joey Deanna.
And I'm Robbie Carmen. And guys, today on this episode, we're going to be talking about something that, unless you've been living under a rock, you have been bombarded by, traditional news, the internet, friends and family, and that is these buzzwords of artificial intelligence and machine learning, AI or ML for short. Now, just to be clear about something, Joey and I have opinions about AI and ML, but we are neither one of us are experts in AI or ML. We are not coding the platforms to do this. We don't know everything there is to know about them. There are doctorates, people who have doctorates and via, PhDs or whatever out there who are doing this stuff. But we thought, because, talking to our friends, our clients, our peers, there is so much buzz about AI and ML in our industry, in post-production, in color and finishing. And, it runs the gamut from editing to, music creation to whatever. We thought it'd be good just to kind of talk about this, share what we think are some of the fears that people have about ML and AI and why some of them probably are unfounded, but some of them might have a little legs to them. And then kind of where we see things going for the future of artists and finishers and colorists like ourselves. So Joey, I think the first place that we should start is kind of the everyday layman's understanding of what is AI, what is machine learning? What do you think about those two phrases?
I have, as you may or may not know, very, very, very strong opinions on the pedantic terminology related to this emerging technology. In my mind, we are completely talking about a technology called machine learning. None of this is AI. None of this is intelligent. The computer does not have any intelligence. The software does not have any intelligence. It is still algorithmically driven by code written by humans. It is not thinking or creating. It is deriving based on a series of inputs. And it does not become artificial intelligence until it can rise up and try to kill me and I have to fight it.
Well, we
can call it artificial intelligence.
Can I make one note?
But right now, we are talking about machine learning.
Can I make one note, though, that's concerning me? As I've noticed there in your setup, you have a Cyberdyne Systems t-shirt on, and you have what appears to be maybe an arm from the Terminator. So I have a question for you. Based on what you just said about, where there's no such thing really as AI, we're all machine learning, do you think AI will be a thing eventually?
I hope not. I absolutely hope not. But if it does, I'll be ready.
So I think it's a great distinction that you made. I think a lot of people use artificial intelligence because it sounds a whole lot cooler than machine learning. Machine learning sounds like a certificate that you'd get at community college to operate a forklift or something, right?
But like the Terminator, also artificial intelligence sounds a lot scarier than it is.
Correct.
Because people are terrified of losing their jobs, about having the evil robots take over all the industry, and that's just not what the technology does. It has no actual intelligence.
Well,
so
I think that's a good.
Don't be scared.
I think that's a good place to start because just to give people a little peek of our history, both of us started in post-production in the mid to late 90s when there was a lot of literally heavy iron machinery going on in suites and machine rooms, big linear rooms, lots of tape decks, that kind of stuff. And we've seen an evolution, of course, in post-production, color, audio, motion graphics. I mean, the idea that, you could set, have an application to fly text around by setting keyframes on, an app used to be mythology back in the day when people were running, big expensive Henrys and Chirons and all sorts of stuff. So the idea I think that I want to address first is this idea of technology evolving and changing, right? And I think naturally that's scary to people. And the thing I think about most actually is two kind of whirlwind changes in our industry. Number one, the jump to desktop editorial systems, right? Moving from $1 million, CMX, Grass Valley, Sony, whatever, linear rooms to people going, oh no, this is my Mac with the Avid on it, and later Media 100s, Video Toaster, whatever it may be, Final Cut Pro, those kind of things, and going, I'm going to lose my job as an editor because I'm working in this $1 million editing suite and now it's on a computer? Like, what? That didn't happen, right?
Yeah, people thought Final Cut Pro was going to bankrupt the entire post-production industry.
It didn't.
It just made it bigger.
It just made it bigger, faster, more efficient, more, this was bandied about a lot, but sort of democratized that tool set to more creators being possible there. And I think that, we've seen a lot of transitions like that number one. Number two, I think the other transition that comes to mind as people being all sorts of freaked out and scared about was when we made the transition from tape-based workflows to file-based workflows, right? People were, unfortunately places like dubbing houses and places like that who didn't change probably did go out of business, but in general, I think everybody can say, hey, a file-based workflow is a hell of a lot easier than managing a fleet of tape decks and the expense of those tapes and that kind of stuff. So change like this, in my opinion, is not anything new to our industry, and I get a little worked up when I see news reports and this stuff, because in my opinion, it's kind of like fear-mongering to a certain degree, right? Like, be afraid, you're going to lose your job. And I think
it's an easy way to get clicks.
Absolutely. And I think it's irresponsible of a lot of, newsmakers to do that, because, that fear-mongering never suits anybody except for ratings and getting clicks, etc. When the reality of it is the majority of us will integrate and evolve this kind of technology into our own workflows without having to be kind of, scared of it. So I think that's one point I want to make. The next point I want to make, and I think I want your opinion about this because it's a little confusing to people. Besides the two terms, ML, AI, there's also kind of this difference in what ML, AI does, right? I think a lot of the news that we see, the hype, the buzz, is about generative AI, and that is AI that is kind of seemingly aware of what it's doing. As you said, it's not really, it's just using programmatic approaches to it, but it's creating art, for example, right? Is that real art or is that not real art? It's doing things like, the new Photoshop ability to like, hey, I need to fill this area, generate something that would look cool back there, right? That generative AI is one thing. What are your feelings about generative AI or machine learning things, these tools that create something? Is that a good thing? Is a bad thing? Do you think it has a place in post-production and finishing for us, even if that's right this moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the most kind of eye-catching, interesting application of this kind of machine learning technology, right? It's the wow factor. It's like a computer made that image that looks photorealistic just based on a text description. That is amazing. But at its core, what it's doing is it's basically taking a gigantic library of learned information, right? It's been fed all kinds of still images, video, corresponding descriptions, words, things like that. Just a gigantic set of existing data, right? And then the parameters are basically going through a bajillion if-then-else statements and kind of figuring out step by step how to make what you asked for in a effective and convincing way. Now, where this breaks down in terms of calling it something like creative or creating is all it can ever do is derive from what it's been given. So if you feed it a crap ton of good photography, it might come out with something that looks like good photography. You feed it a crap ton of bad photography, it's probably going to come out looking like a little bit of a worse photographer if you try to ask it to make a photo. If you feed it all of one ecosystem of things, everything that's going to come out of it is from that ecosystem. So it's like anything else. What you get out of it is going to depend on what you get into it. And what's really interesting for me, for our industry, is not the technical part of that, right? it's kind of the legal, creative, moral part of that, because, and there's been a lot of talk about this, and right now there's not really a regulative framework or even a best practices framework for this. A lot of these generative AIs are trained on copyrighted original art without the full knowledge and understanding of those artists. So essentially, you're just asking a computer to pirate something, copy it, and wiggle it around into a more different set of pixels. Now, that might be the worst case kind of explanation. Let's also talk about kind of the really good case explanation of this. Companies like Blackmagic and Adobe that are introducing machine learning tools obviously have very big legal departments and have very good concern about these legal and moral issues, and they've all basically said, we don't use any user-generated content, we don't use any of your content to train our algorithms, and we don't just go out and scrape the internet to train our algorithms. They're much more targeted, and that does two things. One, like I said, if you put in bad stuff, your results will suffer, so they're curating the inputs to their algorithms with very careful things to make it do what they want, and they're making sure not to kind of steal people's copyright. Now, in that case, the generative AI, in my opinion, has a couple of really good uses. One, like you said, the kind of Photoshop, fill something in, object removal in video applications, for example. It would need to know, what does grass look like, to remove something from grass. And that's the kind of thing where it's not really an artistic decision, right? It's not like the entire creative intent of this shot is removing this shadow from this grass, right? So the execution of that image operation doesn't really have a drastic amount of creativity in it, and it's a great thing for the robot to handle and save you some time. The other thing that I think is really interesting is, if you go back to the idea that I said of machine learning taking this gigantic pile of visual data, this gigantic data set, and then generating something from it. Like I said, it's not making art, but it's making an image derived from its set of inputs. It can be a fantastic tool for inspiration and brainstorming. Try throwing different things at it and seeing what it comes up with. It has a way more diverse source of information than your single life experience or your single life experience as an artist. So using a generative AI tool, God, I shouldn't say that, a generative machine learning tool, even I'm guilty of breaking my own terminology rules sometimes, but using those generative tools for inspiration, finding themes, colors, looks, ideas that you might not have had in brainstorming, that democratizes the creative process, right? It lets somebody who hasn't traveled the world see things and inspire their work with all of this different media that has been trained into these algorithms. So that, I think, is like, that's a really exciting use case for generative machine learning.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and I think I agree with almost everything you said. I will say I think there's some debate to whether or not, how should I say this bluntly, that is there art to coding, right? And I think that there can be, and I was trying to, my kids were asking about, generative AI, because, somebody had, at school or whatever, somebody had mentioned Midjourney and they were looking into it. How does it work? And that kind of stuff. And it dawned on me.
Well, there's also some creative intent to the prompt you give it and how you word it. Well, so it's not completely devoid of art.
Exactly. And it seemed to me when I started playing with it in hopes of finding better uses and or explanations for my kids, I kind of was hit upon something, and I've had the same experience using, ChatGPT. The other day I asked ChatGPT, I said, write me a song lyrics about XYZ, right? And I tried it a few times with different additives, different, changes to the way I phrase the request, that kind of stuff. And it dawned on me that part of the game, if you will, of generative AI is taking what is under the hood. I think you're absolutely right. It's a series of logic. It's a series of programmatic steps that scours different places to figure out what you're talking about, how you're talking about, what you want it to look like, etc. Very complex stuff that I mentioned at the top of the show. PhDs are involved in, and it's beyond me, right? But what I realized about the prompt part about it is that we're taking really programming to the truest WYSIWYG approach that we possibly can. Right? We're saying, just say something naturally in human language, the way you would describe it, however you want, and we'll create something like that. And it's very much a way of, in my thinking, democratizing programming to a certain degree, because you're, instead of typing in all the lines of code, you're just saying it, hey, I want this, right?
Yeah, and I think that's actually an excellent point, because we've seen in the history of computing a lot of different attempts to do that, from like BASIC and Logo and things like that, where they're much more plain language programming languages. I've always said that, a computer will only do what you tell it to do. And these tools are allowing people to tell computers what to do in a clearer, more concise, more digestible for them way. And that's a good thing.
But then my next thought after that was, wow, this is very similar. My interaction with Midjourney or ChatGPT or the Google tools or whatever it may be, the platform may be, the Adobe tools, this is very much the same situation that I'm faced with, you're faced with, and probably a lot of our listeners are faced with, when interacting with clients describing what they want to see happen on screen and for you to change, right? In other words, we are often the AI machine learning algorithm, and our clients are the person putting in that prompt, right? And we've talked at nauseum about client communication, and this is how to interpret this, and people make jokes about us being post-production psychologists and translating what our clients say. And it dawned on me when I was starting this experiment with these tools, it's the same thing, man. It's only going to be as good as the way I describe it and what my needs are out of it, right? And a part of that is wordsmithing and kind of being descriptive. Part of that is learning the way those algorithms want and accept prompts and modifications. Like, you get big result differences out of Midjourney by, clicking different, not clicking, but in sort of enabling different, switches and such to do different levels of quality and, how long it takes and that kind of stuff. And so that was one thing that got me about this, was that, like, I think a lot of people who are blah on this might not be the most descriptive people in the world, right? Their experience with it are going to be different than somebody who's very verbose, very detailed, that kind of thing, versus somebody who just goes, make me a flower, right? There's a big difference between make me a flower and make me a flower that has subtle shades of pink, reds, and blue, with dew dripping on it, with morning sunlight, like whatever you want to throw at it.
Shot with an 85mm lens 2 feet away.
Exactly. So, the people I think who are having bad experiences with generative AI may not be the most descriptive people. But then the other thing I thought about with those people who are having troubles sort of gronking what generative AI does is that I think it takes a while to, in this sense, learn the literal vocabulary of what these tools can do. Just in the same way that we've talked, we're working on an HDR project right now. And, earlier you said to me, I think you pushed it too far. And we've talked a lot about, like, the vocabulary of what makes good HDR grades and not. It seems similar here, right? It seems like there's a scale to this, like the vocabulary of how we interact with these tools is getting better and refined and different. And in fact, the people making the tools are going, we need to take into account when there are one word that could mean 7 different things, right? And how they program that vocabulary and all that kind of stuff, right? So I think it's there. For me, though, Joey, I think generative AI and what we do is right now, like all of it, at its infancy. But for a practicality standpoint, it's really hard to do in video work, right? And I think it's awesome for making a still. Like, my daughter had her 15th birthday. She loves Taylor Swift. Sure, I'll go on Midjourney and go, create me, a picture of my daughter on stage with Taylor Swift with 20,000 adoring fans. And I can do that, and it looks cool, right? It looks like my daughter was on stage with Taylor Swift, at a concert, right?
There's copyright implications there.
That's true. But that kind of thing, relatively easy to create. When I'm sitting in the street with a client, and the client says, I'd really love to have a drone shot coming over the Hollywood hills that reveals Los Angeles with a thin layer of smog at dawn. And you know what? I want it to be very filmic. So I want a shallow depth of field, like that kind of stuff. Way more difficult to create in motion that's going to fit in, right? And I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of us are struggling with these concepts right now, because we're not actually seeing it yet totally in a place that is like, I can make a one-to-one connection on how that's going to work with my work.
Yeah. And, you know, it's always going to be like that. I don't want to be the naysayer that says, oh, this will never be perfect, because, you know, technology does move in very dramatic steps. But at the end of the day, generative AI is never going to replace a photographer or a cinematographer for original content, or an animator or an illustrator. It might help them along as a tool. They might utilize it, but it's never going to have value as just full origination.
That's a great point. And that's kind of where I'm thinking about, as a colorist and what I do every day, where would I want generative AI to step in? And I can think of, just off the top of my head, kind of 3 or 4 things that I wanted to do, that tools exist to do this, but they're not, tell it to do it kind of thing, right? So number one, I think it is the most obvious one is fill and object removal, right? Just be like, whether it's a sky replacement, whether it's, hey, remove that lamp from the background and fill it with part of the table that looks natural without having to do all the roto work and all that kind of stuff. I think that's pretty simple. I think 2, it's about, to me, it's about lights. I would love to be able to go, hey, AI tool, a machine learning tool, I would like to have a tungsten light, a diffuse tungsten light on the right part of this frame. And to me, it would be perfect is not to have it just do it, but then to present, okay, here's a level of control that you have over to further refine that. I've done the heavy lift for you to make it happen, but now you're the artist. I'm just a stupid computer program. Now you refine it.
That to me is the difference between a usable professional tool and a toy, right? The straight text in, image out is a toy or a professional tool for finding inspiration that you then will throw out and then do something on your own. Having the ability to go in and change it afterwards, which is a very tough challenge for the developers, right? Because you don't have a lot of flexibility as to what these systems output. So having the ability to go in and customize after the fact and refine without losing the bulk of the work that has been done, that is the absolute key killer aspect of this that we need for any kind of machine learning tools if they're going to be used in professional post-production.
Well, I had a great talk a couple weeks ago with a friend of mine who is, deep into the world of Unreal Engine, right? And his job has been creating photorealistic imagery that will go on LED volume walls, right? So if, whatever, you're filming a show and somebody's supposed to be on a ship at sea, he'll do all that stuff in Unreal Engine, and they'll put it on the LED volume wall, they'll film in front of it, and nobody knows that it wasn't practical, right? His take on this, I thought, was pretty interesting, that he thought generative AI again, he's using one platform, Unreal Engine, which is popular for this kind of thing. But his take on it was partly inspiration, like you said, but partly also just to get to the result quicker, right? And, he was making the point, if I can design, I could design a mountain landscape from scratch, but it would take me a while to do that. If I can integrate generative AI into it and say, make the mountain landscape, but then go back in with the rest of my tool set, finesse it, finagle it, whatever, that's what he's looking for. And I thought that was a wise thing, as you said, because that makes it not a toy, right? Being able to go,
let it handle the heavy lifting of stuff that's in the background that might not be the direct focus, but still needs to be there.
Absolutely. So I think generative AI, we're going to see that constantly developing. I think the hybrid thing, like I just said, with Unreal and LED walls, that's there. And I think it will get better. Right now, I think in practical terms for what we do in post-production and production, I think what gets dismissed a lot is, and you say this to me all the time as I'm clicking like 39 buttons, right? You go, why wouldn't you just write a script for that, right? But when you say stuff like that to me, you hit on a very valid thing about what we do as professionals day in, day out, and that is repetition, right? I can't tell you how many times a day I click on the same button, or how many times a day I make the same set of exports or files for a different project, right? So I think one of the places, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this because you're Mr. Efficiency, is where machine learning AI can help us with repetitive tasks, because I just envision a situation, the file thing comes to mind when we're finishing a show and we have 74 deliverables to make, right? I would love a situation where one day DaVinci Resolve just prompts me and says, hey, Rob, I've noticed that you're on the deliver page. Last time you made all these exports. Do you want to do that same thing again? Without me having to go and click and make all the choices or set up presets or whatever, it just kind of intuitively knows where I am in the process based on what I've done that precedes where I am at now, and then intelligently prompts me to do something. Just kind of like, my Amazon Alexa will go, hey, I noticed that you're out of shaving cream. Would you like me to order some more? Like that kind of thing, but taken up the next level.
Yeah, and to me, that sort of efficiency booster is, in my opinion, the absolute best use case for machine learning technology in not only post-production, but in any professional industry, because repetitive tasks are wasted time, and wasted time is wasted money, right? When Ford makes 50,000 Mustangs a year, they have a robot do the same welds on every chassis every time and put the same bolt in the same places.
Right.
And a lot of work goes into making those efficiencies so where things can be repeated, where you don't need human input, it's all automatic. And like you said, anytime it's like, oh, I'm doing this 1,000 times, just write a script. That's always my answer. And to a fault, because if I find myself doing anything that's repetitive, my general rule of thumb is like, if I feel like I'm working too hard for this, I probably am, and something should be optimizing it. I've found myself go down ridiculous rabbit holes where I will spend like 8 hours trying to write an incredibly elaborate script to automate a simple task to save me an hour of time.
Right.
Now, part of that is my own kind of emotional attachment to not doing repetitive, boring tasks and trying to find an interesting solution to that problem at the same time. I enjoy that. But part of it is also really saving time. And the value judgment is, well, is this going to be a set of repetitive tasks that I also have to do again in the same context? If it is, and I have to do it often, then yeah, it's worth the 8 hours to write the script. If it's a one-off, probably not.
Right, yeah.
And those little cases, those one-offs, are where this kind of machine learning stuff could really, really, really hugely be useful. Like you said, democratize the programming. If I could type into a prompt in Resolve, hey, take 5 seconds off of every gap in this timeline. Those are pretty simple instructions, right? It could parse what a gap is, find all the gaps, it could parse what 5 seconds is, take those gaps out, right? That would be a manual process that I could easily automate just with a prompt. And that kind of potential, like you said, also having it kind of keep an eye on what you're doing and look for patterns and find things, I envision it taking that even to the next level, kind of like, God, what Microsoft tried to do so many years ago with the stupid paperclip in Microsoft Office. Like, it looks like you're writing a resume. Would you like a template? No. But it looks like you're rendering a PBS show. Would you like us to pull up the specs that you used for the last one?
Absolutely. And I mean, and already we see...
Even more so, here's another one. It looks like you probably wanted to render this as ProRes HQ, not regular ProRes.
Right.
Are you sure? Because you did everything else in this project as HQ, and you might have just clicked, and then that'll save me a re-render if if it spots me screwing up.
Dude, I cannot tell you how many times that little bit of machine learning programming in, for example, in Gmail, has saved my butt, not just grammatically in what I've said, but also saved me so much time. Like, I'll type something and be like, tab to fill in the rest of the sentence, right? Like that autofill kind of thing. And it seems stupid, right? Autofill, like that's not the same thing as, it is absolutely the same thing as, like, it's figured out in a predictive way what you're doing, what you want to say, how you're going to say it based on your words.
You know what's funny? I was writing an email to someone that was, let's just say, quite terse.
Okay.
And Microsoft Outlook, in its new modern machine learning spell check thing, literally came up and said, are you sure you want to use that tone? And gave me suggestions for not being so, like, mean in my email. Now, in that email, I decided to just be mean and ignore it, but I thought that was really, really interesting.
Yeah,
it was right. I was writing a mean email.
And I think that the approaches so far to what we do, rightly so, have largely focused on the creative aspects of what we do, right? So there's plenty of tools out there now that are doing MLAI, shot matching, for example, right? Figuring out the tonality of one shot or a reference and matching it to another. It's cool. Saves a lot of time, because a lot of the time what we do is we're trying to match stuff. There's a lot of tools that will do things based on identification, right? So even in Resolve, like the faces feature, right? Hey, just create some bins for me automatically based on who these people are, right? Super useful. And I think those kind of tools to getting
speech to text that works.
Totally.
We've had speech to text for 20 years. It's never worked until machine learning technology.
And I think that the programmers are right to focus on those workflow enhancements that make editorial, color, all that kind of stuff better. But I think there's still a really large workflow gap, right? Honestly, like that exists for those repetitive tasks that are the next level up from things you can do with, droplets or drop folders or even basic scripts, right? Like the one that, you and I talk about all the time, especially when we have difficult conforms, is I would like a machine learning tool that I can just say, okay, man, here's a folder of media. Here's the reference I got from the client. Go figure it out.
Do it.
Go figure it out. Piece it all together.
And then tell me what you couldn't figure out.
Right. And it doesn't necessarily have to be based on what we've always thought it, time code, real number, etc. It goes, no, this shot didn't have any time code. It didn't have any real number. I just looked at the shot. Right. I looked at the shot and I figured out how to match those two up.
Have it match sizing to a reference.
Totally.
We're already seeing this a little bit with, there's some tools to say, hey, what is that font?
Yeah.
Which is really useful.
Yeah.
So seeing those kind of workflow tools evolve, I think, that brings me back to kind of the original topic of this episode. Is the color is dead? Is the machine learning robot going to take away our jobs? And are the studios going to say, you know what? Robot T800 is going to grade this next series. No, absolutely not. But it's going to make our jobs faster, and it's going to let us spend more time iterating the creative. That's my key here, is like, okay, if we can have the machine learning tool that fixes our conform or helps us with our conform and builds masks for us and helps us make deliverables, like you said, right? I don't want to do an 8-hour project in 4 hours now.
Right.
I want to do the same 8-hour project with
focus.
4 hours less administrative nonsense,
right,
and 4 more hours focusing on iterating the creative. Because the more passes you do, we always work in passes, and the more passes you do, the better it gets until you run out of time, right? So this just gives us more time to be creative, and that is what I'm excited about.
And to flash back to what I said at the beginning of this episode about how people, there was lots of periods of time where people were afraid of that technology change, right? And what were they really afraid of? They were not, it wasn't, yeah, sure, at some levels, I'm going to lose my job and I'm going to be out of a job, right? Really, what a lot of that was about was, I am stable and comfortable with my knowledge base and where I am right now, and I'm scared about learning new stuff and how to integrate that into what I do. And so this, just like anything else, I think is the people who are going to be most successful are the people who are interdisciplinarian about this kind of stuff, learning about generative and repetitive AI tools and machine learning and how to integrate that stuff best into their workflows. I can see a time where the best, colorists and graders and facilities in the world, they're the best because they also have some of the best generative tools, or they have some of the best repetitive tools or whatever, right? Just like we saw a huge leap when, in 3D animation with, tools like Maya and those RenderMan engines and all that kind of stuff, that technology helped that industry do things that were better. And I think the same thing is true with us. I mean, I would just love... God, the other one I think about all the time, going back to some of the machine learning stuff that I think is just there, I would love to be able to say, set skin tone, set the look and set skin tone on somebody and go, hey, look at the rest of this group.
Keep it going.
Keep it going. Like, make sure.
I've made the creative decision.
Yeah.
Keep it going for me. I'll come back and check in on you when you're done.
Screw Rob screwing up Ripple for the 100th time this week, and just let the machine learning figure out how to ripple that change to wherever it needs to go. And better yet, I think prompts to me are a big part of this, right? If I make a decision without the help of the system, right? I go, well, I'm going to make this person a little more olive complex or whatever. The system going, hey, look, I've looked at all these shots and I think that you're making the wrong choice somehow, right? Or whatever, some sort of prompt by saying, are you sure you want to change this? Because this seems correct.
And that goes back to the core concept of what this is, which is a pile of information and a prompt or some user input put together in a very complex web of programmatic if statements. And where that can be super useful, like we've been talking about in a post-production software, is if part of that information is the functionality of the software. That's what we haven't seen yet, right? We've seen individual tools where it's like, okay, we're going to make a depth map. That's what it does. We're going to make a mat. That's what it does. But there's no tool that knows all of the different things that Resolve can do, and then also knows how to interpret English. So you could say, put in a prompt, hey, add every timeline to the render queue for me. It knows what the render queue is. It knows what the timeline is. It knows what the word add means. In this cloud of inputs, it has all it needs to save you time. That's the kind of workflow tool that I think could be really, really cool. And it's never going to do everything, but just to have it, I think would be awesome.
Yeah, and I think the last thing that I'll wrap my last thought on this is, I think you brought up something that's above and beyond our pay grade and knowledge, but I think is really developing fast and interesting to see how smart people figure this out, is kind of the ethical and legal concerns about some of this stuff. Because one of the things that I'm always thinking about when I think about this subject is, as you said several times, the tools are only as good as what they're being fed, right? We did a project a number of years ago where it was colorizing World War II black and white footage. And at the time, it was a really heavy lift with machine learning, giving it as many World War II images as possible to generate mats.
Yep.
And it was only as good as what we were giving it, right? And we had to, scour for thousands and thousands of images. I think part of the ethical and legal part of this is that the powers that be need to figure out a balance between privacy, copyright, and also feeding those engines in a way, because if there was
and transparency, so what's going into what it is, and if your stuff is being used and you agree to the context,
and a way of pulling it out if necessary, right? Like if you accidentally hit scan my timeline for information and it's a music video that is not released yet and the artist is going to be pissed by that, don't share it. I think there's that balance is yet to be found, but I'm curious, as the stuff works through these ethical and legal concerns, how that kind of stuff works out, because I think the data is unbelievably massive in there. And, right now we're going with a slightly small, hopefully, sort of controlled approach to getting some of that stuff, but the floodgates will be open when everybody's stuff is just there. But I just want to do that in a smart way.
Yeah, and in the same vein of the ethical application, I think it's really, 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 really important to make a distinguishing comparison between what a generative fix of an image or a generative improvement of an image is in context of reality, specifically with regard to documentaries and historical preservation and stuff like that. I won't say problems, but big questions and implications to think about with a lot of these machine learning based, for example, rescaling tools. Okay, if you're doing a historical documentary and you are scaling up a piece of film using a generative AI tool, you are adding in information from the modern world that was not there. You are asking a computer to take piles of modern images and make something approximate to what this was, but you have now in some way devalued the historical accuracy of that media.
That's a good point.
And it's the same thing with colorization. It's the same thing with machine learning based like sharpening and noise reduction. Those details that are being put in are fabricated. They aren't real. They were never captured in the original capture.
Dude, it gets...
And I'm not saying there's no use for that and it should never be used. I'm saying documentarians should be very aware of what the technology is doing and the implication to the historical accuracy of archived images.
And it gets worse from there, of course, and we don't have time for this today, but like, I mean, already there is the ethical conundrum of deep fakes and, you know, how that kind of stuff works and kind of creating news and, you know, putting more.
But those are so easy to pick out, and it's so easy to write a program to pick them out. What gets me is like, if I'm doing a documentary and I've got some old film and we scale it up using the best machine learning based scaling, wow, you can see the detail in his face. Well, that's detail that was never captured. We've just made up detail in that guy's face. Is that the right thing to do in a documentary? Only the documentarian can answer that question, but they should be armed with the knowledge to ask that question. And I think in a lot of cases, people might be excited by this new technology, think it does magical things, and not realize what's going into it and the kind of ethical honesty implications of that.
So the colorist is dead. Long live the colorist is what I'm going to say. I think that, it's always been the case that those who adapt and learn are going to be at the top of the heap versus those who, grumble about it and don't want anything to do with it and refuse to learn. So I would urge everybody, again, Joey and I are not experts. We don't have PhDs in machine learning and AI. This is just our opinions as users. But I think I look at it as an exciting time to be in. Certainly interesting for a lot of legal, ethical, whatever, reasons that, again, smarter people will hopefully apply and figure out. But I think us as users, whether it's repetitive fixes, whether it's, using generative stuff in a controlled way, whether that's inspiration or fixing problems, I think we're just at the beginning there. And I think that it pays for all of us to kind of, do our research, think about this and try it out. So plenty to think about with all this stuff, Joey. I think it's been a good talk. And for the Offset Podcast, I'm Robbie Carmen.
And I'm Joey Deanna. Thanks for listening.